Hey, it's CDA, and if you were wondering what you should be spending your development points on, I have you covered. Small disclaimer, the game is still in early access and things will and have been changing, so by the time you see this, there might be small changes into the game or there might be new technologies that completely change the ranking, and if that's the case, I will try to update these guides as we go. Another thing to note is that depending on the resources and especially the rich deposits that you have available in your map, your ranking might be slightly different from game to game, and of course there's nothing wrong with just trying to optimize your strategy towards a certain direction rather than just picking what I'm considering to be the optimal path. Now that we've established that you're allowed to have fun, let's walk through the different technologies from worst to what I think is the best route to go. By far the worst option that I think you have available is foreign suppliers. I have no idea why you would ever want to pick this, because firewood is very easy to make. You don't want to be spending your money on that. And bread, on the other hand, is maybe slightly interesting, but again, you can make your own food pretty easily. And if you're going to be spending money on food, you're probably doing something wrong to begin with. Next up on the list is sheep breeding. This used to be actually one of the stronger development points until it got changed, and right now it will just give you a couple of free sheep per year at most, which honestly, at the rate that that's actually going to gain you anything, is so low you might as well just go and buy those sheep yourself. Next up on my list is beekeeping. Now, getting some honey going is actually not a bad thing, especially if you also take the wax. You can make a decent industry out of that. However, it doesn't really scale that well because you can only get 2 apiaries by default, and generally speaking, I simply think there's better options to pick. The next development on the list is actually forest management. Now, we're actually already getting into the upgrades that are actually pretty decent, and because doubling your berry deposit, especially if it's a rich deposit, does actually provide you with an insane amount of berries. The problem with this is that you're not going to get more berry deposits or anything like that, so again, it doesn't really scale that well, but you could actually make a pretty decent dye factory out of this if you would want to, or just to simply get a lot of food out of that. However, I think there's better options still. Which brings us to trapping. Now, trapping by itself is not that interesting. Getting that passive amount of meat going is really nice, especially during the winter season, but if you combine that with pelt extraction, you're actually going to get a pretty decent amount of both meat and hides passively from those traps. Now, if you combine that with advanced skinning, which doubles the amount of meat, you're going to be drowning in meat and you're going to get a huge amount of hides along with that, which you can also use to turn into clothing. So all in all, combine this together and you do have a decent setup for a baseline industry within your village. That said, again, I think there's better options. Next on the list is the orchardry, so the apple orchards that you can place in the back sides of your plots. Now, if you do this, it will take quite a long time for these trees to actually start producing a decent amount of apples, but once they do, and assuming you have a decently sized plot, this is actually going to produce a huge amount of food, which by itself is pretty useful. The only problem with this right now is that if you just make the same plot and have that produce vegetables instead, especially if you make a rather large plot, that actually produces quite a lot of food as well, so you don't need to invest a development point specifically for that. However, I expect the vegetables to be slightly tuned, and hopefully that means the apples will take over from there. The only other problem I have, and that's why this is further down the list, is that currently irrigation and rye are not that useful to pick up, so it doesn't really lead anywhere to begin with. Something that does definitely lead somewhere is the heavy plow. Now, actually upgrading your farmhouses with oxen and basically allowing you to plow about at 4 times the speed that a normal person would, maybe even more, is super useful if you want to do a serious amount of farming. And remember, you can actually scale this because you can build multiple farmhouses all assigned with an ox, and that will make any plowing, even at ridiculous amounts, really quick. So this is something that does really scale, and on top of that, this actually leads to both fertilization as well as bakeries, both of which are actually pretty useful as well. Similarly, a little bit circumstantial, but if you can get it going, it's really strong, is basic armor making and all the armor types that follow after that. Being able to make your own armor by itself is very useful because buying these things is super expensive, but because they're expensive, actually selling these things is also very useful. It's a pretty good way to get a strong economy going very early on, but this does kind of require you to have a rich iron deposit, otherwise your iron will run out really quickly. So again, it's a little bit circumstantial whether or not this is actually going to be useful in your particular game. Which then brings us to the last remaining two directions you can go in, and which one of these two is actually better will depend on what you're trying to do. Charcoal burning by itself is already really strong. The kiln building will allow you to double the amount of fuel that you're producing, so that's kind of a necessity for your village to have either way. But on top of that, the charcoal actually sells really well as well for a pretty decent price. So it's in a really easy way, if you pick this up early on, to get some money flowing into your bank account. Now the reason I rate this so highly is because this is something every village is going to be using anyway, so you might as well pick that up. Now on top of that, it actually leads to deep mining, and deep mining will allow you to turn a rich deposit into an infinite resource. Now I like my infinite resources, so maybe it's a little bit biased from my side. It's not something you need to pick up early, so after you pick up the kiln, you can go in a different direction and then maybe with your third or fourth point pick this up. But once you have this basically means you will never run out of resource. You will always have something to sell. So if you're going for a pretty long game, this is going to be super useful. And then last but not least, we have trade logistics. This is a technology that initially I thought was a little bit overwhelming. Sure, you get a reduction on setting up a trade route, and the reduction can actually be quite significant, but you can make more money, so why is a discount that nice and interesting to have? Well, first of all, the discount is indeed quite significant, so this actually adds up really quickly. So if you compare it with some of the other options, you might actually take quite a while to earn back the money that you could have saved by setting up a cheaper trade route. Now on top of that, just because you can easily pick up multiple trade routes makes you a lot more flexible in terms of what you're actually going to be buying and selling. So that just makes, for example, setting up a trade route to just sell a couple of weapons or buy a couple of weapons, to name an example of something you typically will be doing, a lot more economically viable. On top of that, this leads to better deals, which is exactly the thing it says. This will reduce your prices, your import prices to be exact, by 10. Making the import of resources a lot cheaper. This is typically like 2/3 of the price, or sometimes even more than that. So getting that much of a discount actually makes it viable to just import a lot of raw resources, then transform them into something more expensive, and then resell those. And because you can set up whatever trade route you want, because it's pretty much free, not entirely free, but almost free, you could just completely transform your entire industry within your village with just a minimum investment. I mean, remember, if you demolish buildings, you actually get your resources back, so you don't lose out on anything in that way. So you could just switch your farming industry into an armor making industry and then just start importing iron or something like that, and then switch it back to something else. All in all, this just makes you so flexible that especially in your first village, where you're likely going to be hosting the most of your industry, and you can always send from new resources, or new regions I should say, you can also always send the production to your main village. Having the ability to just pick up all the trade routes that you want is super useful, and that is why I think this is by far the most flexible and safest pick. Doesn't matter what type of resource you have in your village, this will always be useful. So whenever you're in doubt, basically pick this up and you will not regret it. Similarly, the charcoal burning is always going to be useful, and the lead up to the deep mining is likely to be useful as well. So you can't really go wrong with picking up either one of those. That said, let me know in the comments, is your ranking the same as mine, or did you find other ways to abuse these technologies that actually should imply that the ranking changes? Especially if anyone found the use for the foreign suppliers, I would very much like to know what your use case was, because I haven't been able to find it whatsoever. If you're still here, you're awesome, and I do hope you found this useful, so don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to catch you in the next one.